tradies not working a full week. They've worked out they can charge twice as much per hour if they only have to work half a week. Tell me I'm wrong, but that's what's going on. No name on that text. Well, okay, let me just put that in another sense. They're working half a week, if that is the case, which don't know many. But yeah, they can charge, that whole supply and demand thing. So the supply of skilled workers, well, they are in demand. And you know what? That pushes their prices up. This is the whole point, the whole idea of what we're talking about. Plenty of incentives for first home buyers, but what about incentives to get the skilled workers in to build and increase the supply? Are we on the money? Let's find out. Let's head straight to the coalface. Steve Chandler is a building and development expert and the managing director of Lefter. Hey, Steve, good morning to you. No taxes for apprentices. Is that a good idea, or is that just me having a thought bubble? Good morning.
Mate, it's a great idea. Why not? We've got to get more tradies into the workforce. So, mate, anything that we can do to get those people doing trades has got to be a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, can I get your take on the housing policies dished up on Sunday? Both parties, both campaigns, they were touting them and speaking them from the rooftops, with the rooftops that aren't getting built, sadly.
Well, funnily enough, you look at what both parties are doing. The Labor Party said they were going to build, 1 million homes in 5 years, or 1.2 million homes in 5 years, and nothing's happened. The Liberal Party are now saying they're going to spend all this money or give all this money for infrastructure. Great, but mate, politicians, it just doesn't work. They don't do. The money disappears off into somebody else's pocket and never gets to where it's needed. What we really need for them to do is to just say things like, for example, just get rid of the GST. Get rid of the GST on brand new property, and suddenly people demand for that property will increase. For the new stock, and that will stimulate developers to come into the market and go, okay, we can now develop property. So instead of there being a shortage of housing, you're going to have a bigger influx of property into the market, and that's what we desperately need. We need. I don't want to have a discussion around immigration, but if we slow the amount of immigration coming into Australia, the demand for the housing is going to drop, and that will help ease the problem. But at the moment, where developers can't really make money out of development, means that they won't create stock. And we've got a problem.
And we've got a problem. And, we're touching the numbers that I'm looking at, master builders, HILO, they're talking about the shortage. And as I was saying, building and construction, I was thinking of constructions of what needs to happen here in Queensland, not just houses. But coming into Brisbane 32, we're building a lot of stuff. There's going to be a lot of construction, a lot of cranes, a lot of need for skilled workers which we don't have. We keep hearing about a supply shortage. It hasn't changed in 10 years. What, besides that little tax one I was throwing out, what are you hearing? What are you seeing in the industry that would incentivise more people to pick up a trade?
I think if we wound the clock back, 25 years or maybe 30 years now, when we used to have, the school certificate, the leave school at the end of what used to be fourth form and what's now year 10. Lots and lots of kids are now being forced to go into year 12 who probably would be much better off getting out at the age of 16 and going and doing a trade. And, that's what I did. I came through the trade, and at a young age, at the age of 16, and, I'm okay. I've done financially quite well for myself. And anyone who's young, when you're young and you're sort of forced to stay in school when you really don't want to be there, you get to the end of year 12 and everyone says you have to go and do a degree. We've got a bunch of, kids out there, young adults, who have done degrees and they can't get a job because they've done these abstract degrees, or, they've done a degree that they really didn't want to do because if they had have left school in year 10, they could have been a tradie, earning full income before, their friends have finished uni. I think we've really got to look at what we're trying to do. If we need tradespeople, we need them to leave school at year 10, be qualified tradespeople by the age of 20, and then get stuck into resolving our trade crisis. We can't just keep importing, trades from overseas. They don't, people who come in from overseas, they may be, bricklayers and, electricians, etc., but they've got to learn our codes. So they've got to sort of spend a few years learning our codes before they can go off and, do work by themselves. So I think we really do have to focus on getting the young people into trades again.
Steve Chandler, my guest this morning, a building and development expert. He's the managing director of Lefter. Steve, paint us the picture from boots on the ground. What's it needed? What's it look like when it comes to getting these builds done? How much of a delay or how slow is it that you've seen in your experience, maybe compared to, I don't know, a decade ago, 2 decades ago? How difficult is it to get a tradie and to get things built on time?
All you got to do is look at the price. Yeah, the price. When a tradesperson can charge you a squillion bucks, then there's not enough trades out there, and they can put whatever price they want on their labour, because they only need to earn X dollars a week or so much a month or a year. They don't need to work for $1 an hour, for example, if they can charge $2. So they only work half the time and make the same income. So over the sort of like through the COVID period, the pandemic, prices went through the roof. Now that was both on the price of materials, but also in labour. And in Brisbane, you look at what's happening with the Olympics. The same thing happened in Sydney, in the lead up to the 2000 Olympics. Like you couldn't get a tradie for love nor money. And prices went through the roof, and then post-Olympics, there's nothing. So it's feast and famine. So your prices in Brisbane are going to be growing, getting worse and worse and worse over the next 10 years or 8 years, right? And then they're going to plummet because there's going to be no work, and all the trades that are moving out of the southern states heading north are then going to evacuate out of the northern states, heading south, and flood those markets. So it's a really frustrating thing for us in what we do, in that Sydney used to be the most expensive place to build in Australia. Then it became Perth. Now Brisbane's sort of leading the way as well. It's just the Olympics does amazing things. It brings infrastructure, it gets a lot of sort of things happening. And that's great for the city, 5 or 10 years after the Olympics. In the lead up, it's a nightmare of construction and traffic and absolute chaos. The 5 years after, it's the disaster recovery when everybody vanishes and nobody wants to build anything because all the tradies disappear and there's no work and no one wants to invest because everyone's leaving. Housing prices will drop off. The southern states, their construction prices are going up because trying to keep the tradies, stop them going to Queensland. And then when the flood comes back, in 2032, the prices will plummet in those cities as, there's too many trades. It's one of the things I will say about property development, it's really difficult. And for us to be able to provide housing, we've got to look into the future and say, look, what's going to happen, and are we willing to put our money into a project now when payday might be in 3 or 4 years' time? Is it worth it? What's the market going to be in the future? Because you got things like Donald Trump happening.
Steve, appreciate your time. Good stuff, mate. Steve Chandler, Lefter Building and Property Development. That's his business. He's making a lot of sense. I'm reading through all of your texts that are coming through, and most of them, the majority of them, the bulk of them saying, Steve is spot on. This bloke knows what it's about.